Welcome to the Ed3 podcast, where we're building the future of learning. And I am so excited to have our next guest. She's basically like the Justin Timberlake. She's bringing creativity back. Yeah. And she is an educational movie star, if you believe that. She's the creator of the Designing Schools documentary. When she's not leading world-class design thinking workshops, you'll hear her on her podcast of the same name, working to reimagine education. This Trojan believes the future is a place we create, and she really cares about learning, which I love. It comes through in all of her conversations, and her experience as well as a teacher and educator shines through. We're going to dive into a lot of that. So please welcome the greatest Sabba since the Sabbas, Dr. Sabba Quidwai. Welcome.
Thank you. That's such a generous.
It's so fun to have you. This is like talking to an inspiration and inspirer. I wanted to jump right in. The subtitle of your documentary, I love so much. The future is a place we create. How do we create it? Because as you often say, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. I've heard you mention that a number of times. I love that quote as well. So what do we need to do to get it evenly distributed or bring the future forward?
Yeah, I have big questions. I do want to say, first of all, that line is actually one that the principal of the Design 39 used. It's that public school that we did the documentary on. And so that was his core belief that he used to talk and share with everyone, the future is a place we create. And so I think to answer your question, like that's where it starts, is with the belief and to know that you have the agency to create the future, and that the future is not being created for you, as I think so many times people often feel. And I think what's so beautiful about that is there is no one same future for everyone. It's contextualized, and you get to come together with people in your community, your friends, your family, your organizations, your teams, to have those conversations about, who do we want to be and what do we want our future to look like?
Yeah, I love that idea of agency. And I know you're able to go around and talk to different schools and organizations. And I feel like there's this tension between the macro world of we have AI, we have new tools, we have all like decentralized credentials, whatever it might be. But then you also have the incredibly local micro of like, I have kids walking my class in 5 minutes. How do I prepare? So I'm curious, when you talk about, creating the future that we want to see, how do you kind of balance that of like, here's a bunch of stuff, but then also here's how you actually take action in the next 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think you nailed it when you said, here's a bunch of stuff. And I think that's one of the, I was just having a conversation with somebody about that this morning. And, we were talking about design thinking, and we were talking about like, these experiences that come about when you create these things. And she was like, okay, but then she was like, do you think we need to add a piece about the science of learning? And so I was like, it's going to be embedded within. And I think it's one of the challenges we have when we present things. Like I was listening to this morning, there's a podcast that Jel Mehta and Rick, I don't remember his last name, do. And they were talking about, they give me another example of social emotional learning. It's like another thing. It's like, these are things that are embedded within. And I think because we present things like creativity, literacy, math, this and that as these like individual pieces, it does then become a bunch of stuff that's overwhelming. Like, how am I supposed to do all of this together? And then I'm also working by myself, right? Like that's a really big theme of the documentary and my work is like, how do we create the time and space for teachers to collaborate more, come together through what we're energized by instead of asking people to do this themselves? And so I think when we begin with recognizing that your one experience encompasses so many of these things and can encompass these things, that's really where it becomes, I think, more manageable, even mentally more manageable first before physically actually going out and doing that. I think the mental stress is a big block. When you are already overwhelmed by, oh my God, this is so much, you're frozen in that anxiety and that stress. Whereas when you begin to realize like, oh, okay, these pieces are interwoven and here's how I can now go and apply something like this or take step one towards application, not feeling like I need the whole picture and the end grand solution. That's when I think we can slowly start to make progress towards, I think, the things it is that we want to see.
Yeah. Yeah. And you talk about empathy, and I hear that coming through right there. So you have a background in the classroom, and I'm just curious about how you bring that empathy when you speak to educators, because you know how hard it is in the classroom, but then you also know like some of these things could actually help you, right? And so I guess, how do you kind of help them get over that mental barrier? How do you encourage educators? Like, what are some tactics for them to get past that so they start using some of this potential?
Yes. So I actually just this week's podcast, I've been talking literally about this because
Okay.
one of my favorite things to do in like keynotes or workshops is I have these 3 questions that I love asking when I talk about this topic or design thinking, because I really think you need a flavor of agency to be able to be empowered enough and optimistic enough to be like, okay, this is something that just might work. So let me go try it. So the first thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is like, I feel like, I don't know if you remember this, like, I feel like a lot of times when we were talking in the past decade and whatnot, we're always asking this question, like, what do we want students to learn to best prepare them for tomorrow, right? It's like such a common question we ask that there's this one quote that I love from Gravity's Rainbow, where he says, if you get people asking the wrong question, they never have to worry about the answer. And so it just made me wonder in this age of AI, and really was inspired by Atomic Habits, was what if instead of asking what we want kids to learn and trying to like figure out and come up with all the answers for them, we were to begin by asking, like, who do you want to be? And you answer the question with them instead of for them. And so it's a way I've been opening my talks lately. So this is like what I would say is step one. When thinking about your role, like, who do you want to be? I think people first have to reconnect with that human part of themselves that is so lost in like the day to day of what it is that we have to do sometimes. So by asking people, I'm fascinated by the answer. Like, people don't say titles. People don't say the typical things you would think. People say the most human qualities that like AI can never replicate. Like, I want to be a mentor. I want to be a safe space to my colleagues. I want to be somebody who's reliable that others can count on. I want to be somebody who is motivating to my peers, like these kinds of really human qualities. And so as we go into the talk a little bit more and we start talking about design thinking, I have then 2 other questions that build on that. And the first one is, if you think about the next 1 to 3 months, what is just one thing that you've been interested in trying? Just one thing that you've been curious about, that's been on your mind, that maybe you saw, but you were like, oh, can't. And then what's the barrier that's holding you back? And I am like in awe of the vulnerability with which people will share with a room full of strangers. So like, imagine what it would be like if you asked like, people that you knew and you kind of made that like, I say it's such a great like dinner conversation these days as well with every the acceleration that we're seeing. Like, what do you want to try? And like, what's holding you back? And then like, okay, how might we create a solution for this? And taking something really small like that shows people how just reframing something creates a different path.
Yeah,
Those are
I
my
love that.
favorite
It
3 questions.
no, I love it. It reminds me of, my entrepreneurial days of an MVP, right? A minimum viable product. It's like, how do you get something out there? But it's almost like a learning minimum viable product. Like, what's the fastest way we start learning? And I always steal that phrase too of like in the entrepreneurial world, build in public where you're sharing as you're creating. But I think people need to learn in public as well. And I think, you do a great job of that. But I think about how can educators really start the conversation using some digital tools better, because I think, like you said, it's the future is something we create, but if we don't take agency, then others are going to do it for us, right? Or it's just going to happen. And I'm afraid of that if educators aren't a bigger part of the conversation, that they will just get steamrolled by the speed and the power of kind of bubbling up change, So yeah, that's really fascinating. Well, I know that we've talked a little bit about like individual culture change. Like you're talking about how do you get a teacher or an individual to change their mind? So how do you kind of take that idea to an organization like a school? Like how do we, I guess, make fertile ground for them to actually make changes? Something I've been thinking a lot about the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it's like top of mind for everybody right now. You know, what's really interesting, actually, it actually happened for me the other way around. That I didn't
Oh,
start with
wow.
individuals. It actually happened with me and it was very much by mistake. So I used to be a high school history teacher, and, I was working at an organization and I was teaching history, but I also became the director of ed tech. And because I was so familiar with K-12 and like, you know how it is sometimes when you're excited about technology. This is, by the way, back in like 2013. It was like a long time ago. You've come a long way. It was like, oh my God, we've learned these apps. These apps are amazing. We're going to go do these PDs on this session. Everybody else is going to be as excited as I am. And then, of course, it's like, now we know like people are not as excited as you are. They see it as one more thing, like all these different things that they're frustrated by. And so some people were excited by these sessions, but definitely not the scale that you would hope for and the sort of integration that you would hope for. And so fast forward like 2 years later, I ended up getting an opportunity to be again, director of innovative learning at a university. And it was a physician assistant program, like family medicine program. And it was like, I was a history teacher. I took like geology as a science because I hated science that much. And now I was in like this like med school environment and I was just like, I knew nothing. And so the director there was very, very empathetic and was like, I know you'll be the person who can help us. So take your time, just observe, do whatever you need to do to better understand and take your time. Like there was no kind of like rush. And I remember observing classes and like watching these kids sit in there for like 8 hours a day, or like, teachers would talk at them for 2 hours and then be like, so any questions? And like crickets, and it's just like, this is so like, I was honestly more in awe of how obedient the students were. Like, I was like, I can barely sit here. Like, how are you sitting here? And so what started happening was just like these very organic conversations with people. And I remember sometimes people would be like, oh, I'm just so frustrated by this. Like, oh, like this is going on. Like, I'm still overwhelmed by this. And I remember just like having random conversations like, oh, did you know we could do this? Or like, have you ever tried this? Or have you thought about this? And so what ended up happening was, as instead of having this sort of like top down approach, it was everybody was kind of doing something a little bit different. So we had these like different projects running. But the reason it was manageable, because when people will ask like, well, how did you manage so many? When people begin to identify, this was my big takeaway that where like I learned that innovation begins with empathy, is if you can figure out what people are frustrated by, but also what they're motivated by. There is a balance there. I hate this and this is what I really want. And you can give them an idea of how they could begin to get there. You give them a step one. The ownership they will take over that process is tenfold compared to you being the top down, trying to integrate and create the answers for everyone. And so it sounds like because people are doing different things and trying different things, it would be more work, but it's actually less work because they've taken the agency and you're kind of now just that person they'll come to. Hey, this wasn't really working this way. Like, I have a question here. How might this work? And it's sort of this like co-creation that happens that is so, so, so powerful. And so I think from a culture perspective, I think building the trust is essential. People have to feel safe with you. I didn't realize, like, I didn't set out to be like, okay, I want people to feel safe with me. But it is when you take the time to ask a human question, you will build a human relationship. And so I think then, later on when I did my, research, I then studied like, okay, how do you actually formalize some of this stuff? How do you assess for some of this stuff and whatnot? But yeah, that's kind of where it came from. I think organizational, I think having conversations with one another, listening to one another sounds so simple, but it's rarely done in organizations.
Yeah. Well, keep going down that thread where you're headed because, empathy feels squishy, right? And like someone comes in and says you should be empathetic and you're like, yeah, I know. But what are some of the things you kind of learn that work either to instill that or like you said, the measurements or outcomes that you're seeing potentially, especially in educational environments from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I do think like the research is important and knowing like some of those things helps give you more confidence in introducing a strategy or learning why a strategy is important. And so the two that really resonated with me was the work that Amy Edmondson does on psychological safety. I love her quiz. It's like 7 questions. It's so easy. It's anonymous. You can just do it with you in your organization as a baseline starting point. I think as a leader, I think it's important to have that baseline. Like if you get your survey results back and you feel like, wow, people don't feel safe, like sharing an idea, or, everybody is excited to share an idea, or people are really confident about taking a risk. How are you building on your strategy using that data? I think that's really important and helpful. The second thing I think is a really interesting point of study for people is Project Aristotle. I think it was like just fascinating that like when they did, I always forget the name of the first one. I think it was Project Oxygen, where they did the leaders and they wanted to know what made a successful leader. And that one was really easy. It was like just flowed and they got their answers and it flowed really well. But when it came to what makes a great team, they got busted. They couldn't come up with like a core set of variables. And then what ended up happening, long story short, it turns out that it's not your GPA. It's not like any of these traditional metrics. It's the norms and values that you have on your team that create that psychological safety that allow for people to feel confident sharing an idea or taking a risk. If those two things don't exist, you need that data to know where your empathy work needs to begin. But I do really think that just having the conversation of like, what are you interested in trying? Like, what's challenging for you right now? Like, what concerns do you have about whatever initiatives that we have going on? But also the flip side of it, your dreams, your hopes, and your motivations. I feel like that piece is often missing. We focus a lot on challenges and problems. We don't focus enough on people's dreams and desires and hopes and motivations. But it is those things that fuel your ability to actually dive into your challenges if you can see a path forward. And then from there, one of the reasons I love design thinking is the structures and frameworks. Like, why do the extra work? Like, you don't need to come up with these things. These are trusted guardrails you have to go into a messy space, to feel confident as a leader. I think, opening that door. I see a lot of people who are like, like, oh, I don't know if I want to do this. Like, I don't know if they just want to be told what to do the same way everybody else does. And I think that the design thinking structures give you a guardrail, give you confidence to be able to be like, okay, I'm going to have just this part of this conversation. And then we're going to move to step 2. We're going to just address this area and then build and build and build. And once you show your teams, I think, that you are building in this way, or even if you're an individual doing this, you can show others how you got from A to B to C to D. It starts to build that momentum that then it gives other people optimism that, oh, so if I try that, I hear that a lot. Like, oh, if I try that, then it could be like this. And it was one of the driving motivations for turning the research into a documentary. People need to see things that are new. They have to see them. They have to visualize them, and then they have to see themselves in it. And so if you can merge those two aspects, and the frameworks are all there to do so, it's not something you have to come up with on your own. I see it every day that people already have the knowledge. They don't have the motivation and culture often to be able to act on the knowledge and dreams and things they want to overcome.
Yeah, I've seen that in the classroom too. One of the exercises I stole from my friend Cam Hauser is the hello video, where we have students do a selfie video and send it to one person that they haven't talked to in a while. And it's the idea of the scariest thing I think you can ask a student is to hold up something and say, I made this, right? And like get critiqued or people telling them it's not good, that's a bad idea. It's like years of being told, you're not good enough in whatever way that happens. And it hurts, right? And so having that culture of safety where you can say, I made this, I have this question, I don't understand this, it seems simple, like you said, but it's actually undoing. You have to like unlearn so you have space to be creative, which is, I think the skill that's going to be needed for the jobs of the future. I really enjoyed, I think a recent podcast you had, I really enjoyed that conversation. You talked a lot about next gen jobs, which is the area I work in as well. And so I'm really curious to hear you kind of talk about tying what we just discussed with empathy and creativity into that and how you think about what a next gen job is and how educators, like, is that something they should even have to worry about? Like the fact that we don't know what after these jobs are going to be anyway. How do we build that into our educational systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my big passion projects is taking the design thinking model and teaching young people about how they can apply that to their career. I feel like when I look back over the last decade of my career, specifically if I look at the last decade, so many things came from so many opportunities that I had came that weren't even on my radar. Like I think the problem is, first of all, like when you think of a job and you think like, okay, what job am I going to do? You've already put yourself in a box. And these days, because so many industries are interdisciplinary, where people need expertise, it may not have to be your full-time job, but there are I think like instead of thinking of like a job, like I really encourage people to think about like streams of revenue for themselves that allow you both independence, but stability in some places as well. So for example, you may have one full-time job if that's what you want, that's your primary source of revenue. But then because you have an understanding of different spaces, because you have a network of people, because you are, a voice in your space, which doesn't always mean you have to be a leader, but you are a voice in your space, you could be called upon by tech companies for consulting, for apps that are being made for consulting, for all these different things. You could, share knowledge in a passive like an online course. Like there's so many other ways to think about streams of revenue but all in the service of what kind of life do I want? You know? But I think a lot of those questions are things that you just don't think about when you're younger. You're just trying to get the grades, like do the things, go to college, get the degree to get the job. And then you get the job and now you're trying to think about, well, life. And it's so much harder to work at it from that standpoint. Whereas when you reverse engineer that process and think about, well, like I want to be able to have some independence. Travel is a priority for me, or family is a priority for me, or, whatever those things are that matter to you, being able to know that you can design a life around that versus having to fit those pieces in is something that I think is so important to talk about, especially with this generation. And I think for people who don't see how young people today are creating these pathways for themselves, it's so hard to even imagine that that could be your life. But I think about, like, I have a nephew who's like 4 and I have a niece who's like 5 months. Their world is just going to be so different that the things they'll be able to do and prioritize and value are going to be so different than what we were able to do, especially when I think about the human things, the family, the relationships, where you want to spend your time and what it is you really want to do outside of work. So those are things. But if I had to narrow it down, it's like very broad. Let me super narrow it down. I think one of the most important things for young people today is to understand your values and what energizes you. And that's not an answer you come up with in 45 minutes. It takes years to come up with those answers. It's a lifelong journey to answer that question. And I think the younger you start, the stronger and more confident you are in being able to see things. I'm going to actually quote a student. So I have a course that I do with students called Design Your Future. And recently the kids were presenting at a conference about their experience. And a really big part of the course is helping the students build a professional network using LinkedIn. They're sharing their ideas, they're seeing what's out there and whatnot. And one of the students shared, they said, now that I have this vision, I see everything with a different lens. When I have a project, I look at it from a point of view of, like, how could I share this? How is this contributing to my goal? When I am assessing internships, I'm looking at how do I share the story of what I'm doing and things like that. So giving kids that lens to view the things that are coming their way or whatever it is they're engaging in, I think that's really important, because too often we don't have a lens. We're just passively going through things. So giving them that lens of, like, how is this contributing to my life? How can I showcase this? How can I make a story out of this work that allows me to put value into the world and into my network? That I think is I think that's life-changing for being able to control your career more and be able to have more freedom to pivot when you want and have access to things that you often see other people do and wonder, how could I do that too?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the concept of, like, streams of revenue or streams of impact, maybe not always monetary, or I've heard it called personal holding company, where you yourself are the conglomerate and you have all these things underneath you. It seems to fit the world we're headed towards, and also the interests of students and probably us too, right? Where you're not going to go 40 years and get the gold watch at the end. But a lot of people also just need to have a full-time job, and telling them that full-time job doesn't have to be the only part of you, right? Like, it can fund the passion or the impact or the exploration. I think that's important. I don't think people hear that very often.
No. And then not only do they not hear it, they don't even know how to do it. So we're watching all these people all the time do it. You're consuming them all day long, but knowing that you could have that too. And then, but again, I think the really big one for me is the freedom that opens. When tomorrow, all of a sudden there's a pandemic and you decide you want to change something, or you just decide, like, hey, I don't really like this anymore. Maybe I want to do something else. Having positioned yourself in that way is ultimately what allows you to make that pivot. But if you get that feeling and you're like, all of a sudden, like, well, I want to try something new, and you have to start from scratch along with that feeling, that's really, really, really overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's not something you get as information, right? Like, it's something you have to try and see, right? Like, so it kind of goes back to where we started of getting people to take that first step, because you won't figure out what you care about by just reading or just thinking. You're going to have to actually do it and see how it feels and the impact you can make.
Absolutely.
Well, I kind of wanted to end where you start the trailer for your documentary, which is Seth Godin and his famous line, what is school for? Like, what is learning for? And if you've talked to all of these well-known thinkers, design thinkers, educators, what are you thinking it's actually for? And maybe how has your mindset or ideas shifted through these conversations?
I feel like for so many people, it could look different, right? You think about people in like developing countries, you think about people in first world countries, like everyone's problems are so unique. And so often everyone wants to create a solution for like somebody else. And so I think a really big part of like what I would love to see education or school be are sort of like almost like the heart of your community where you are like nurturing a generation to be able to have the agency to create what it is that they want, what that community wants. And, I feel like with the AI piece, especially lately, really being able to lean into what makes you uniquely human. Like, I feel like every single day we're seeing like a new chat GPT prompt, or this is what you can do with AI. This is what you can do here. And not enough focus on how you nurture the human side of yourself. And I think being able to create a space where people connect more with like imagination and agency to create, like gives you more agency over the prompts that go into that AI for how you're going to leverage this technology. Like, are you going to leverage it just to create, just to perpetuate what we've already been doing in faster ways and, things like that? Or are you really going to use it and help people see how they can leverage it to get back the things that have been taken in many ways because of this industrial model? Like the industrial model isn't just about school and, grades and age, silos and things like that. It's about the fact that we spend the majority of our lives working. Like, I don't know how, the fact that now that there's a different way, or there could be a different way where your workday maybe is like like, for example, if you think about your weekend and your workday, like just typical work week, what if that was switched? What if you only worked 2 days and these 5 days were now yours to be able to do what you wanted to do with? What would that look like? And that is a very real question that people can ask now, given what we're seeing. And I can't even imagine what like the next year, like the last 3 months have been wild. I can't imagine what the next year is going to be like. But Kai-Su Lee wrote about this. He wrote a great book a couple of years ago called AI Superpowers, where he kind of talked about, China and the he uses China and the United States kind of as the two, who's going to come out on top. But he doesn't give you an answer. What he basically does in the book is propose all these questions about, what type of government do you need to be successful in an era like this? Like, can democracy really thrive when you have technology accelerating at the pace that it does? Or does a more authoritarian system like China help people accelerate faster? Like, there's no answer. He just kind of gives you the scenarios for what's happening on the ground in both places. But he talks about his own experience having developed cancer and how it shifted his mindset. He talked about, when like his wife was giving birth to their first daughter, he had this really big Apple meeting. And he was just like, the whole time my wife was giving birth, I was just thinking, how can I get to this meeting? How can I get to this meeting? And he, stepped back and said that the greatest challenge we're going to have with AI, yes, the typical things we see around like safety and security and all these things, that he said one of the biggest human challenges is, what is your identity when work isn't the majority of your life? And what does that look like? What do you do with your time? How do you spend it? What do jobs look like in that space? So I think that's the really interesting question for people and for schools to help people answer, to reconnect with your humanity. And what do you want your life to look like? From how do you want to design it? And then what are the skills and mindsets that are going to give you the confidence to advocate for what it is that you want in your community?
Yeah, it's so poetic. It's beautiful. Thank you. I think that, it really is amazing to think about. You said the future is a place we create, and that's actually quite scary for a lot of people. Having agency is quite scary. And I do think, as you mentioned, having a more human element is a superpower, to have knowledge of artists so that you can prompt the graphic design to look like specific artists. Like, now you're actually a better creator because you know art history, right? Or if you're eloquent in English, or you're able to imagine other personas and have empathy, you're able to prompt AI to do different things. And it's almost the most prepared individuals will be those that have more humanity, which is a challenge, I think, for all of us to try to instill.
Absolutely. And I think, just so people don't think we're like idealistic and like not, reality driven, I do think though one of the biggest challenges alongside that is income equality. I think, when you only allow a few people to take advantage of these, and only a few people have the skills, that gap in income that we see becomes a gap in lifestyle, becomes a gap in access to resources. And I mean basic resources, like just home, like basic resources. And I think that creates a horrible, dangerous tension in society. And I think a lot of people don't make that connection to what we've seen happen over the last couple of years. Is there's a very large, I mean, I was talking very specifically about the United States, but you have a very, very, very large majority of people whose infrastructure has not been supported, whose schools are not preparing them for what they are about to walk into. And as a result, people are going to struggle to get employment, to get wages, and just, I think, to move in this direction without creating a pathway for income equality becomes a huge problem because, yes, we're looking at all this stuff as if it can be used for in the best of ways. But when you don't create the space for people to have their basic needs met, it also opens the door to, I think, things being used in the worst of ways, and tension and hatred and animosity with no context because they don't understand how the world is changing and what they're living in. So I do want people to know that we do have a dose of reality, which is why I think schools become one of the most integral institutions as we go through these changes.
Yeah, it reminds me, I was on a call with a superintendent from New York this week, and she was talking about them initially banning ChatGPT and how they're trying to bring it in. And she said, as a public school, if we're not exposing our kids to this, we're actually increasing the disparity. And I thought, that's just really important for us to remember. Like you said, schools are one of the few places where people generally get outside of their bubble, at least to a greater extent than in our day-to-day lives. And it's really the place where I think we can live up to the democracy that we purport to be, right? And give everyone an opportunity. So like you said, there's challenges, but we also have hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
So tell us kind of your final hope or dream, I think, for education in the next medium term, like 1 to 5 years. And then remind us where we can find you to read more about your hopes and dreams.
That's, honestly, right now, I would love to just see people stop. Like just know that you have the agency to stop. Like you get to pause and you get to say like, hey, like, let's reassess, or let's get together and talk about this. Or, you know what, with everything happening right now, maybe we don't have to make, like, a lot of people, it's so interesting to me how a lot of people like are always looking for somebody else to change the problems first. Like, no, first we need policy. First we need the system to change. And like, I always think back to like Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. And like, if you read that book, you realize like, there's never been a time in this country where policy came first and change and progress came as a result. It was always one person who took one step, But if you think of somebody like Rosa Parks, for example, like when she made that decision, she probably wasn't thinking like, this is going to be some revolutionary. She just decided like, I'm not going to do that, And I think knowing that you have the agency as a human being to say, I don't want to do that, opens the door to opportunities. Now, I think you have to also have, that's again why I say lean on those design thinking structures. Don't just be like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. And here's a better path forward that we can explore. And here's how. I think it's a big missing piece when people try to advocate for things. They don't have the follow up. And I think if you are willing to do that right now, I think people are listening. I think people are looking for you. And I think people want that. They just don't all know how to be it themselves. But I see it happening in so many places, especially with teachers. Like, I can't emphasize this enough, how much we think we need to teach teachers everything and, they need to be told what to do. I don't see that. I'm sure, like, definitely, there's always like places where, yes, we do need that. I think they just need the time and space to do what they do best. And it was one of my favorite lines. Like Joe, the principal of Design 39, had so many great lines. Like, the future is a place we create. That was his line. He had another one. He said, these are all structures that are human done, and they can be human undone. And I think that would be my thing. Like, you can undo these things and you don't have to be like held by, you don't have to be in the shackles forever. Like, you get to free yourself if you decide to do so.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, Dr. Quidwai, where can we find you? Where can we connect with you? And where can we continue to get this hope?
Yeah, I feel like designingschools.org is probably the best place. Like, I always tell people, it's like choose your own adventure, whatever you want to take from that you like to read, if you like to watch videos, if you like to listen to podcasts, like, go choose your own adventure. But that's kind of I do think the podcast is probably one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite learning spaces. I would say the podcast is really for me more than anybody else. But you learn so much from the people. All the people who I bring on are all people that I really learn from and value. And so it's my way of being able to sort of like bring them to you as well.
Yeah, well, it's not just benefiting you. I also enjoy, and I know others do as well. And like you said, lifting up voices and amplifying the future is really important because we do have to make things more equally distributed across all vectors. And I really appreciate your work doing that. Thanks for coming on the podcast today. Can't wait to listen to your next episode. And we will see you all, hear you all, talk to you all soon in the Ed3 podcast. Thank you all for being here.